Very cool. Anything else? I think that's it.
Fantastic job, man.
Well, I mean, everyone should expect that from the world's best interviewer.
You, absolutely. We would expect nothing less.
And if I sucked, well, the person listening didn't. Was a bad listener. Let's just be honest.
They
This is
weren't listening.
sarcasm, people. Let me make sure you have the context. Sarcasm, like. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another edition of the 1004 Show, a part of the Zack Miller Says podcast. Hope you guys are enjoying all of this wonderful content that is being produced. You know, when I started this, it was really to just help some of the clients that I was working with have a voice, get their stuff out there. But then I realized that a lot of people were engaging and listening, so I decided to reach out to other people. And I'm super stoked that we've been able to get well above the century mark. And I love doing this, so I hope you guys do as well. If you guys like what you're watching, or if you're looking for a specific guest, hit me up wherever you're listening to this. Just press like the message Zack, or just email me at Zack, Z-A-C-K, at startwithhatch.com. Maybe I'll put that in the show notes, or just hit me up. So we're here with Chad Stenzel. Chad and I actually live in the same neighborhood, and well, not in the same neighborhood, but we live in the same region. And I've known Chad for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now. We have enjoyed our conversations, and I actually really respect Chad. He is a professional at sales, and many of you guys are thinking that's a 4-letter word. That's a naughty no. We're gonna get the parental whatever. You can't listen to this episode. That's not true. Sales is not a 4-letter word. We talk about that. Talk about the strategy Chad uses to get his positioning back, and if the worst thing, the thing that we hate, all of us probably hate, cold calling, is actually dead. Woo! It's a hot topic. It's a great episode. Chad Stenzel and me, Zack Miller, just dropping knowledge bombs. Well, him way more than me. So without further ado, let's go. So you are a trainer, a helper, a coach, a man who is a legend. When people ask you, when you meet someone at a networking event for the very first time, they say, "Who is Chad Stenzel?" What's your answer?
Well, in true Sandler fashion, if they're asking me that before I know anything about them, then I've messed up. So when I meet someone at a networking event, the first thing I do is ask them about themselves, because frankly, that's probably going to help me shape my answer when they ask me about me. So when I'm at a networking event, the first thing I do is find out who they are, what they do. What do they love about what they do? Do they have any challenges in the things that they do? And when people ask me, as inevitably they do, so what do you do? My response is going to probably be tailored to some of the things that they do in business, because I am, as you said, I'm a coach, I'm a trainer. So it depends on what you do. For instance, if you were say a small business owner, Zack, and we met, and you were a guy who'd maybe done all the selling for, built up your business, and you are now, struggling to find people who could uh, sell for you as you expand and grow. And then when it flipped around and they said, "Well, so who are you? What do you do?" I'd probably say something like this: "Well, Mr. Prospect, I've worked with small business owners who have been used to selling their whole lives, and now have built their business to a point where they struggle to find people who can sell the way they did. And maybe they don't have the time to train people, or they're frustrated that they can't find somebody who will stick with them and grow with the company." So I work with people like that. Just out of curiosity, I don't suppose those are issues you struggle with at all. And that sort of leads to that next question. So, and I'm going to have obviously a little bit different response if I'm talking to a VP of sales for a company with 5 to 10,000 employees, or maybe I'm talking to a realtor who's just on their own, selling. So uh, what I do, obviously translates into different markets, different verticals. And so when people ask me what I do, it kind of depends on what I've learned about them.
All right, a couple of pieces from that. I love how you do that. But what if someone walks up to you and they beat you to the punch. How do you turn that on them?
Well, in the honest answer is I usually somewhat self-effacingly say as little as possible, and everybody kind of laughs about that. And I say, "Just out of curiosity, what do you do?" And every time they'll go right into what they do. So that's my response.
Okay, so let's role play this. So I walk into a networking event. I'm walking up to you. I go, "Hey, Chad, how are you? What do you do?"
Is that as little as possible, Zach? How about yourself?
Oh, so that's what you say, as little as possible. Ah, that's clever. That's good. That is really good. I'm proud of you for that. So my favorite, you know me, I'm an anomaly, I'm weird, I'm different. My thing that I like to talk about now, and I've actually done this with people, so I'm not just saying this, and someone I did it on, they were like, I'm really confused. They asked me afterwards, like, I don't get why you did that. And so the idea is that I ask someone, what are you watching on Netflix, basically? And I'm trying to really create that personal relationship with me because like you know this in your training, I know this in just the sales that I've done, is that no one's buying on that first date. No one's buying at that first meeting. And so if I can create a real relationship with them on something that they're really passionate about, and a lot of times it's around content that people like for whatever reason, then I can have real conversations with people about that content. They can tell me about the story or the movie or the documentary that they're watching. And then that person becomes I can start having conversations with them around that specific topic, and then every time I see them, that's who they are to me. So like before it was something about sports. So you like the Minnesota Vikings and that stupid skull chant or whatever it is. So I might just bring up the Vikings with you every time, and people don't get why you would do this. And to me, it's like you're having real relationship. You're having a real friendship with that person, and friendships and real relationships last forever. Not last for one transaction. I think that's where most people go wrong. They're trying to get that small win, and I'm like, yeah, well, when that person leaves their current venture to go do something else, if you were only focused on that venture, guess what? You're screwed. Now you don't have that relationship. So, do you think this is a good strategy as someone that does this for a living?
I think that's fantastic. You're absolutely right. And so here's my philosophy on sales, and we'll call it influence, because I think really some people struggle with the word sales, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But everybody wants more influence, right, with people, and the only way to truly get influence is to understand that person. And so I think where a lot of people make a mistake is they go, what, even a business networking event, right, where it's sort of expected that, okay, we're all here for a specific reason, right? We're here to meet other business people and network and build our personal network, our business network. People make the mistake, I think, of treating a networking event as a sales call. And that's the worst thing you could possibly do. A networking event should be to get to know people. It should also be to start to file away information to decide if this person could be a qualified uh, prospect for me, or maybe just a referral partner, or whatever. So yeah, it's okay but learn about them, gather information about them. Don't. Here's what I tell people all the time: nobody cares what you do or what you sell, right? They just don't. They may ask you about it, but they truly don't care. What they really care about is themselves, their own issues, things they're going through. So learn about those things, and then as you learn more about them, and some of that can certainly be peripheral or sideline. It'll give you that opportunity to build that relationship and earn the right to maybe move to a actual meeting, right, or a sales opportunity. And so I'm a big believer that you should always only be selling the next step. And so in a networking event, the next step is not, hey, do you think it makes sense for us to do business together? The next step is, should we grab a cup of coffee sometime, right? And not everybody in my world, because, and I'm sure you do the same. We both, I know, meet with a lot of people, but we can't meet with every single person, right? We don't have time to meet with every. So there is a bit of a qualification there as I talk to somebody. Some people I may not say that because I just don't have time to do coffee with every single person that I meet at a networking event. So we do a little qualifying, but it's just, would it make sense to grab a cup of coffee sometime and find out a little bit more about what we do? And that's really, in my opinion, that's what a networking event should be for. It's not to try to quote unquote find your client, sell your client. It's to figure out if it's worth exploring that relationship a little bit further.
I love that line. Networking events are not sales calls. Man, that was powerful. I might actually take that and post it on Facebook one day. That was really good.
Oh, you're
Um,
welcome to it.
for so people hate the word sales. You mentioned that. Why? Why do people hate sales, or the concept of sales?
Well, yeah. So let me ask you a question, Zach. When you just, and I know it's a little different for you and I because we're sort of living this, but in general, when people hear the word salesman, what do you think some of the images are that come to mind for most people?
Well, you got your used car salesman. You got like the shady, shisty
Yeah.
guy in a full suit. Like I don't know, like someone that's selling insurance. Like the
Yep.
the random call that I got a couple minutes ago trying to give me a business loan. Like these people.
And so we have these images of people who are, as you said, shady, not truthful, probably only out for their interests. And I think a lot of that is thanks to Hollywood, frankly. You very rarely see somebody in a sales role in a positive light in movies, right? People who are CEOs or particularly adept at sales, usually in most movies, not all, but in most, they're trying to pull something over on someone. And so I think that's part of the issue. And I think, frankly, personal experience is another part. You mentioned the used car, right? Everybody can probably have a story about walking onto a car lot at some point in their life and not being treated really great, right? Somebody comes out of nowhere and starts putting sort of the high pressure on you, showing you this car, walking you around, opening all the doors, and let's take it for a drive. What do you think? And as you pull back in, they say, should we just go ahead and pull it into the sold spot right there, right? And so a lot of us have those negative connotations because that's the sort of some of the images we've had. And so a lot of the clients I work with, yeah, I certainly work with people in traditional sales roles, but a lot of people are not. We work with uh, engineering and accounting firms, and even law firms and financial advisors, and some of these people who really struggle with this word sales, but they all realize they need client development, and they all realize that look, if we don't have enough clients, then I can't practice whatever my expertise is. And so a lot of times with those groups, I'll take sales out of my vocabulary unless I know they're okay with it. And we'll talk about client development or we'll talk about influence because people understand that. People realize that, look, in this world, influence is important, whether I'm talking about my kids or I'm talking about friends or spouse or people at work that I work with, and certainly people who I engage with, looking to increase my business. And so that's where I think some people see sales or hear sales, they get that negative connotation. So in that case, I'm fine with, okay, forget sales. Let's talk about client development. Let's talk about influence. Let's talk about how do we figure out how to help people make a decision that's good for them.
Lots of note taking here. You know what's interesting though is I bought a car. I bought a Jeep, brand new, 7 years ago.
Sure.
It's my dream car, and I've bought. I've probably bought 4 cars in my entire life. I've never had a bad experience on a dealership lot. Ever. And honestly,
Yeah.
the guy who I bought the Jeep from, I mean, he was a salesman at the Jeep dealership. I still call him. He still texts me. So is it Hollywood in that case? Like, or is there really shady people? I mean, because I mean, it's really interesting though because it was the first thing I said, and probably because it's been glorified. It's been,
Yep.
uh, but like literally, this guy he'll keep calling me. Like he has good sales techniques in there too, which a lot of
Sure.
people don't. So is it that the used car salesman is actually shady, or is it just that Hollywood screwed it up?
No, I do think Hollywood. That's why I mentioned them first. I think they get first shot of that blame. Here's the other thing you got to realize, and I don't know the numbers. Maybe you do, but there are probably tens of millions of people in some sort of a sales role in the United States. Fair, if you think of across all industries. So it probably, it wouldn't be unusual to believe that there are some bad actors, bad apples out of that group. I will say overall, I do think the car industry gets a bad shake because I think they have improved. I think if you went back 30 years, maybe even 40, there was a time when I think there was a little bit more of that. I think it's improved because the buyer now, Zach, and this is why I think sales training is so important right now. The buyer is so much more savvy than they were even 20 years ago, certainly 30 plus years ago. So if you're still, for those people who are still acting in some of those sort of high pressure ways, um, I think that, that's not a good long-term strategy. It sounds like you dealt with somebody who was very professional, and I think most salespeople really do try to be professional. I think there are some other things that salespeople still struggle with. For instance, one being they go straight into talking about features and benefits way too early, in my opinion, or way too often in a sales call. But I do think a lot of that high pressure, that sort of that slick talking stuff, has gone away because, frankly, it just doesn't work anymore, right? I can walk into a dealership now and I've already got my Kelly Blue Book app on my phone. I've looked on Auto Trader and compared them to 12 other dealerships, and across lines, whatever you're selling, it's true in this information age, that information is out there. So I think it's much harder to stay in business now if you react that way.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Before we get into some of these other questions, Leonardo DiCaprio, Wolf of Wall Street, is he like the greatest salesman of all time in that movie?
Well, it's an entertaining movie. I love movies about sales. Of course, it's Hollywood too, right? So even though Jordan Belfort's a real person, I'm sure were a lot of liberties taken as that movie was being filmed to make it as interesting as it was. Do I think he's the greatest salesperson of all time? No, I don't think so. And so the logical follow up is, who is the greatest salesperson of all time? And I'm not sure if I have that answer for you. I know several that I admire, and so one of them to me, and you wouldn't think of this person maybe as a salesperson, but when you look at what they've developed and accomplished, I go to Walt Disney. Look at the lessons from his life and what he was able to do, and how he was able to influence and change so much of the country and even the world. So there was somebody who overcame a lot. If you've ever read his story, overcame a lot of adversity. Was fired from a local newspaper because they said his cartoons sucked. He couldn't draw cartoons, so he gets fired from that job, and then goes on, right, and rolls the dice on himself. Believes in himself, believes in this little character, and the rest, as they say, is history. So somebody like that, I would say, would be somebody I'd look at and say, there's somebody who's really shaped the world, and they frankly did it through sales, right? I mean, he had to sell his way at every step, and that's every business owner, right? Whether we want to admit it or not, whatever our product or service is, we're salespeople, right? We've got to be able to sell what we do.
My favorite business owner, entrepreneur, maybe salesman too, is Vince McMahon of WWE. And I think when you really think about what he's done, and people who have listened to the show live heard me talk about him, so I'm not going to talk about him for forever, but the guy can sell, and the guy knows how to storytell, and it's pretty impressive. Yeah. All right, so networking 101. We've talked about it a little bit, but how does someone start to grow their network if they're kind of just getting started, or they're trying to improve it?
Well, so I think there are a number of ways to do that, and I can, as a business owner, I can give you maybe a little formula that I use and that worked for me. One is you've got to go where, if you're going to just network, and let's just say first networking in the traditional sense, right? So let's go to places where there are other people. I think it's vital to figure out where your crowd is. For instance, and you and I have both done, I know, work with the local chamber of commerce, right? And one of the things that I always talk to people, and I will recommend to some people, I don't recommend it to all people, but there's certainly some business owners, sales professionals, I'll recommend, hey, have you looked at the chamber? But I always sort of teach a lesson when I recommend them, because some people will join the chamber and you could substitute any other networking, right? We could talk about JCs, we could talk about Rotary, we could talk about BNIs, right? There's a lot of, so just for this example, talking about the chamber. So I always tell people, if you're going to join your chamber and spend the money for it, don't do it unless, number one, you're going to actually try to get something out of it, right? So don't join the chamber and think automatically that means your phone's going to ring or that doesn't happen, right? We both know that. The other thing is don't join it unless you know you can get in front of your target networking audience. And so when I walked in and joined the Hampton Roads Chamber several years back, I walked in and actually had a conversation with the sort of the membership director at that time, and I said, "Look, I'm considering joining the chamber, but here's a few things that I would need to get before I spend my money, because there's a lot of things out there looking for my money when it comes to networking." And so I gave my list of three, and my list of three were number one, I need to be involved in a board. I said, primarily a lot of people I'm looking for are business owners. I know you've got networking opportunities, but some of the networking opportunities you have are not really my core audience. So I'm looking for people who are either business owners or maybe VPs of sales, things like that. So I need to be involved in the board. Number two, you've got this education series where people are teaching and talking, and that's what I do. So I would need to be part of that education series where I get a chance to get in front of people, not to pitch what I do, but just to teach, right? Some of what I do and to have that visibility. And I said, number three is I need to work with your people. Because your people you are out there selling memberships, and if I'm a part of the chamber, I'd want to know that I'm contributing in some way. So I need to work with your people, and we can talk about what that looks like. So that was what I asked for, and in that meeting they agreed to all three of them, and they lived up to all three of them. And so when you ask where should people go networking where your the avatar of your client or your prospect for networking would be. Don't just show up at everything expecting, because you just don't have time in the day, right? I think we've got to be somewhat targeted in where we network. So that's the first piece on networking. So the other thing, how do you build your network? This may be controversial to you. I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I always laugh. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, looking at posts and reading things. And one of the things that I see and hear all the time is that cold calling is dead. Cold calling is dead. And usually it's tied into this idea that we should be on social media, and we should, and I absolutely agree we should be on social media. I think that's a big part of what we can now do. But I also happen to believe that cold calling still works fantastically. And I know it does because I've done it and I've seen the results of that. And what is a cold call? A cold call could be something as simple as just walking through the door of a business and introducing yourself. And I usually, when I do that, Zach, I usually bring a book with me, one of the Sandler books, and I'll say, hey, I've got a book I'm here to deliver to the president. Would it be possible for me to talk to him? And so if I can get in front of them, I hand them the book and say, hey, not now, but I'd like you to take a look at this, and maybe when there's a better time, I'd like to come back and talk to you about how I work with, and I talk about issues that I think they may be dealing with. Would that make sense to you? So that's a cold call, right? You're just walking in, giving some value, introducing yourself. So that's part of what I've done to grow my network as well. And then the other thing I think that you can never overlook is using your current client and influence database, right? And working them for referrals. And so, I mean, I've got a lot to say about referrals if you want to go that route, because I think most people do referrals completely wrong. But that, to me, that's, those are sort of some of the core things I've done to grow my network.
Very interesting. So, do you think that I think cold calling is dead or controversial, that statement? Like, why'd you say that?
No, I don't necessarily think that, but a lot of people do. And I don't know that we've ever completely talked about that. I can't remember. So I say that, knowing that you might come back and say, well, why would we ever cold call in this day and age? I don't know the answer to that, but I don't happen to believe it's dead.
So I think, just like the Hollywood term that you said before, the problem with cold calling is this, right? And people can't see that it's not just this. Hello, I don't know who you are. I'm terrified. Cold calling can be done a million different ways, right?
Sure.
Something on my calendar every single day is to introduce myself to 5 new people. I do this through a technique that I call the fraternity of podcast guests, which is taking the relationships that you have with other people who have this other network that you have a connection to, and reaching out to them and saying, hi, I know you because of this. I just wanted to say hello. And people respond.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think you do stuff like that too. I mean,
I do. I do. And in fact, I know you've had one of your recent guests was a guy named Bob Berg, who I introduced you to via a direct message on Twitter, I believe. And so here's the amazing thing, and Bob's a very successful speaker and author. And if anybody's watching this and hasn't watched that, go back in the archives and look for that podcast, because I think it was a fantastic one, and not just because I got a shout out on it. But it's so easy now to reach out to people, and whether it's through Twitter or LinkedIn, Facebook. There's so many avenues now where you can reach out to people that were not available before. And so in some ways, some people, I think you're absolutely right. They think cold calling's dead because, well, I used to be able to call into a company and maybe get through to a decision maker. And now with the advent of voicemail and caller ID and the gatekeepers, that it's just impossible. Well, go around all that. Follow an influencer on LinkedIn and send them a direct message. It's amazing not only how frequently they respond, but how quickly they'll respond to something like that.
You know why, right? Because no one else is doing this, right? I don't think cold calling is dead. I don't think it'll ever be dead. And I think cold calling is the wrong word. I think it's just simply introducing yourself to people, right? Cold calling has a bad connotation to it. And like I said, I try and reach out to 5 new people a day. It works very well. So when you got that Bob Berg shout out, like what were you doing? Like, how did you feel? Like, what was it like?
Oh, it was great. It was great. Bob, I've known Bob or, followed Bob for probably 17 or 18 years now. And so when I was a very young sales manager in one of my first roles, I attended a weekend event hosted by a guy named Jim Rohn, who, if anybody is not familiar with him, and Jim's passed away a number of years ago now, but he is absolutely probably my number one mentor in business philosophy, and just a brilliant man. You can still find his stuff all over YouTube for free, so look it up. But Bob was a speaker on that program, and so that's when I first was introduced to Bob Berg, and I heard him talk about endless referrals was I think the book at that time that he was most known for, and it was just this idea of how we should be. I can't remember if this was his phrase, but I've heard somebody say this before: milk your own cows first, right? And the idea was, imagine if you were a dairy farmer somewhere up in Wisconsin, and you got up early every morning and you went over and you milked all your neighbors' cows, and what would be wrong with that? And of course, the idea is you're missing the easy stuff, right? So I think that that's one of those ideas. But anyway, so Bob has been an influencer and somebody I've looked up to for a long time. So it was great to have that shout out from him, and great to hook both of you up and put together hopefully a mutually beneficial experience.
He's a great dude. I've since listened to his book, The Go-Giver Influencer. It's very good. But I think what you're getting at there is the whole low-hanging fruit. Right? People think that they have to like throw out like the fishing line and reel something in. I'm just like, oh, why don't you just take the little basket, go to the front, and figure out like what's there? Because there's probably a lot there. You have the relationships with them already, and instead of wasting your time on crap that doesn't want you, why don't you just scoop up the ones that want you?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting to me about this, because I ask this question a lot to my clients who have even been in Sandler for some time, and I'm talking about people who are pretty adept at sales, right? They may do very well, make a good living at it. And when I ask, rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective are you at asking for referrals on a consistent basis? Do you know what the average score is for these advanced salespeople who have been through the training?
What's it out of 5, 10? What is
out of 10. You know what I hear most generally?
10?
No. I
0.
hear a 2 and a 2s and 3s. For some reason, even people who are able to get past this, stigma of selling and sell, now when it's time to ask for a referral, they struggle with that. And so, I try to one of the things that we talk about is I sort of I'm a big believer in playing psychological games with yourself. I think we all have to do that to some degree to get over certain, blocks that we have. And so one of the things that I teach is like the minute you make a sale, you start to talk about referrals. And if you're not comfortable asking for referral, you bring up the whole process at least of referrals. And you say, look, um, Mr. New Customer. At some point, after you've had a chance to test drive all this stuff just a little bit, I'm going to come back to you because one of the top ways I grow my business is through referrals from happy clients like yourself. So would it be okay? Is it okay? When I come back, in 30 days or whatever your time frame is, right? Is it okay when I come back if I ask you for some referrals? And of course, the answer is always going to be, well, sure, yeah, of course. And then you can even, if you're really feeling bold, go one step further and say, uh, just out of curiosity, you wouldn't happen to have anybody that comes to mind right now, right? And one of the things, Zach, that I talk about when you're asking for referrals is you always want to sort of put a frame around the type of person you're looking for, right? For instance, I'll give you an example, Zach. When I say, hey, Zach, who do you know that might be a good client for me, right? And most people, when I ask, or when anybody asks that, they say, I don't know, nobody comes to mind, but if I think of anybody, I'll let you know, right? I mean, we hear that all the time,
Right.
and the truth is that you're talking about way too big of a, broad of a spectrum there. But if I say, Zach, if I happen to know, for instance, that Zach works out regularly at the gym, I say, Zach, is there anybody you work out or see at the gym that you think might be a good client for me? Or Zach, is there anybody that you play golf with, or is there anybody that you are in this business association with? And so the more you can narrow that down, now all of a sudden you might think of some people. At least you have faces that come to mind, right? You're like, okay, well, this person is no, no, no. Oh yeah, this person that I work out with, actually, runs an accounting firm, and they might be a client. So that's part of it, is make it easier for them to think of someone. Because if we just say, who do you know? Too broad. Most people will just be stumped and say, I don't know anybody.
So you're putting them in a location. So you're basically you're narrowing it down to something that you know that they do. So like, could you just say like, is there someone at the chamber that you've done work with, like type of thing? So
Somebody,
just because then
absolutely.
they know people specifically.
Absolutely. And it's, of course, this is based on what you've been able to gather about them, right? One of my favorite Sandler rules, and in Sandler, we operate a lot under what we just call rules, and they're really principles. But one of my favorite Sandler rules is, in sales, you're not compensated for the information you give the prospect, you're compensated for the information you get from the prospect. And so if I've done my job and gathered a lot of information about them, now it makes it easier for me to sort of focus that in. So if I know that they're active in their church, or they're active in the chamber, or they're active in their local homeowners community, whatever that is, that gives me that frame of reference to talk about, to get them to think, well, who do I know there? And so I think that's the first part of referrals. I think the second thing that most people really miss when it comes to referrals is they think a referral is, let's say that you call me up, Zach. You say, hey, Chad, I got a great referral for you. You need to call Jim Smith over at ABC Company. Okay, great. You have his number? Yeah, here's his number. It's right here. Give him a call. He'd be a great referral for you. Okay, fantastic. Thanks. And people walk away thinking that's a referral. And I'm going to say that what you did is give me the opportunity to go cold call someone. And we already talked about how much people love to do that, right? And so to me, a good referral is what I call a warm referral. And a warm referral would be when you call me up and say, hey, Chad, I got a good referral for you, Jim Smith at ABC Company. I say, Zach, tell me a little bit about Jim. What do you know about him? Why do you think he'd be a good referral? And I ask some information, right? Get a little bit of background, at least from your standpoint. And then I'll say, Zach, I'll tell you what, would you mind making an introductory phone call or email? And sometimes even, would you mind setting up an introductory meeting that we can all three meet at? But I'm having you do that handoff. And I make it easy for you, because what I would say is, Zach, here's when you call Jim, here's a couple things you might want to say to him as you're checking his interest, right? You might want to say, Chad, somebody we worked with here, and he did this, right? Here's what he did for us at Hatch. Boom, boom, boom. I think he'd be a good person for you to talk to. Would you be interested in talking to Chad? And would it be okay if Chad gave you a call, right? So now you've warmed Jim up for me. You've made that call, that connection. It's no longer me calling essentially into a cold call that's called a referral, but you've actually helped sort of facilitate, bridge that relationship. And I do all three of those all the time. And sometimes we'll do the lunch thing. We'll say, hey, Zach, tell you what, since this person's pretty close with you, how about I take both of you out to lunch next week and I'll buy, and so I'll have that person set it up and we'll sit down and we'll talk. And so there's what I call a warm referral. That's the kind of referrals we ought to be getting from clients and referral partners, not this, here's a number of somebody, give them a call, good luck.
What is Sandler?
So Sandler Training is it's actually a franchise of trainers, network of trainers. There are 250 of them in the United States, and there are, I think, close to 300 worldwide. Uh, I happen to own the Sandler Training franchise here in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and so and it was started by a guy named David Sandler. He wrote a excellent book on sales called "You Can't Teach a Kid to Ride a Bike at a Seminar," and it's sort of and you might be able to guess what that is, but it's sort of his philosophy on sales and sales training, and this idea that, look, you can put your people in a one-day seminar and they can walk out of there all pumped up and think, okay, this is great stuff, great. I learned how to do all these closes. I'm going to go out and set the world on fire, and then they go out into the real world and they stumble the first time they try it, and they say, well, that crap didn't work, right? And they never try it again. And so one of David Sandler's philosophies was, we believe in the power of reinforcement. So our training is generally ongoing. It requires a time commitment. And then, of course, there's the entire Sandler system. And I can tell you, it's very prospect focused. Probably, in my opinion, the greatest asset that you can pick up as a salesperson and probably even in life as an entrepreneur or whatever is to learn to ask good questions. And I know you take pride in that. I happen to notice, Zach, that your LinkedIn lists you as the greatest interviewer in the world, I believe. And so, but that's what we teach. We teach people a system for sales, not because you have to put yourself in a box, because every sales call is going to be different, but you ought to know the plays ahead of time. And you also ought to learn how to ask good questions.
I believe it's the best interviewer in the world, not the greatest, but I'll
Okay.
let's just slide. What's interesting is I did that at some point over the last, 6 to 9 months. I kept hearing the same thing over and over again. Oh, that's a really good question. Oh, that's a really good question. Like with every single interview. And I was like, that's interesting. Maybe I'll start telling myself. Maybe I'll start telling the world I'm the world's best interviewer or something like that. Whatever the phrase is. And then it became like this, and I don't think it's like a cocky little thing. And I also don't think I'm the greatest interviewer, but I do think that I listen really well, and I do think I analyze questions, and I'm observant, and I want to learn, and I want to learn for others. So I'm interested in asking questions that others are afraid of. So when I posted that, some people were like, "You're a jackass. Like, who says that?" And I'm just like, you know what? Like, to me, marketing is getting someone to look up from the 7 screens that they're looking at right now. You clearly did that. I did my job. You're talking about me. Thank you very much. Like, let me bow and tell you why I'm better than you at this in a nice, kind of way. But am I doing a good job? Like, do you think maybe I am the best interviewer in the world?
I think you're a fantastic interviewer, and I had to smile when you were talking about that. You mentioned one of your idols, or one of the people you think was best at business and sales, was Vince McMahon. And doesn't that sound like something that Rowdy Roddy Piper would have said, right, on Piper's Pit back in the day? I'm the best interviewer in the world with total confidence. And you're right, it gets clicks, it gets links, but you also back it up, which I think is important.
Right. Now, if I said that and I was really bad at it, I know I'm good at this, right? I don't think this is
Sure.
if someone asked me what am I best in the world at, I would not say interviewing people. But I know that when I do this, I ask good questions. I think people like it. So we'll check that one off and say that I'm okay with that. Thanks, Mom. So a lot of things I still want to talk about. Influence. How do you define influence? You've used that word several times.
Sure. Well, I think influence is your ability to get people to consider things that either they haven't considered, or to do things maybe differently than they're currently doing them, right? And so it's pretty generic, but I think it's generic on purpose because, as I said earlier, I think influence is is something that we can use with our kids. It's something we use with our employees. It's something we use with our friends. It's something we use certainly in a selling situation. And so, I think one of my favorite books on influence, uh, when he's written several of them, is a guy named Robert Cialdini. And I don't know if you've read any of his books or not, but Cialdini is a brilliant guy. I think his most recent book is called Prefluence, and it's this idea of influencing someone before you're sort of ahead of time, right? And how do you build that into your but Cialdini is a interesting guy because he's a marketing uh, professor and also a sort of a psychologist, and so he builds all the psychology into the things he does. And here's what he found, and not that there's nothing new under the sun. I always tell people, whenever somebody thinks they have an original idea, I always sort of chuckle, because there's certainly, we can tweak things, but when it comes to sort of fundamentals, those have been around for a while. So he talks about how are people influenced, and so he's got different principles of that. But one of the principles of influence is, and this will shock no one, people like people who are like themselves, right? And so one of the first things when it comes to influencing someone, I think, is we've got to figure out, where is that common ground? How do we, and how do we find that out? By observing and asking questions. And so we ask questions to figure out, where's that common ground? Because if I find people that I can find common ground with, on whatever level that is, I know now we've got something in common, and that's starting to lead me towards the ability to influence them. Because if we can't find anything in common, it's that right away, that's going to make it harder for me to influence them in any direction.
Well, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I don't have a lot of friends that aren't business owners. And I realized that once when someone was like, actually, someone earlier was like, "Oh, you excited about the weekend or the holiday?" And I was like, "What holiday?" I'm like, I don't even think about those things.
Yeah, well, and that's true of people, right? And so that's where we go into this idea of finding common ground, because most people are friends with people who are pretty much like them. Most people tend to live around people who are pretty much like them. I mean, and that's sort of the way the human psyche is set up. And so when we're going to attempt to influence someone, we need to find some of that common ground. If we can't connect in some real way, back to your example of, what are you watching on Netflix, or what are you into, right? Those kind of questions start to develop some sort of that baseline. And so people, and that leads us to the next part of influence, which people will do business with people they trust, right? But it's hard to trust someone if you don't see, right, some commonality there. If for instance, we both went to UVA, right? We find that out. I said that on purpose because I knew I would get that reaction. If we both went to UVA, though, Zach,
At least it wasn't Virginia Tech. That'd have been even worse.
let's say we both went to West Virginia,
Yeah, smart men.
and but right away, right, you'd find that common ground, and you'd build. So finding those things, I think, are important, because then it uh, starts to lead towards trust. And there's a number of things that go into building trust, but that's certainly a big one of them, is having that common ground and that influence. I think the other piece that Cialdini talks about, that, and I won't talk about all his points, but the other one I think that's important is, uh, people tend to, as much as we try to, especially in America, right? And I'm sure I'm guilty of this too. We try to talk about this rugged individualism, right? And hey, I'm my own person, and I go my own way. And for instance, a book such as, I don't know, a title like Anomaly comes to mind, right? And standing out and being different. But there is a certain human psychology that says we also kind of like to go where we know there's a bit of a crowd, right? And so the example I use for this is, yeah, I do a lot of traveling. I used to do more traveling even. And when I would travel into a town I've never been in, and let's say I'm looking for a place to have lunch, and I pull down small town Main Street, and I see a couple restaurants, and one of them, the parking lot has like two cars in it. And there's another one where I see full parking lot. Not only that, but there's like a line of 8 people, or standing outside waiting to get in. Well, guess which one? Unless I'm really pressed for time, guess which one I'm going to every single time? I'm going where the crowd is, right? And why is that? Because there's this idea that, well, if these people like that, then I might like that. It's probably good, right? I've never had food from either place, but I'm using that, that sort of that crowd to say, well, this is where I want to go. And so one of the things that we
That's
can
like
do to
that's like your gauge.
Yeah.
crowd is the gauge. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's exactly right. Right.
there was a part in the book that I don't think actually made a final copy, but it's about how in college I threw parties, and if you have a party that sucks, no one's gonna go. Like they might show up and then they'll leave. Like you go to a bar, same thing. It's the same concept, right? Like
Sure.
people do want to go. Like people will wait in line for this thing that looks amazing, but they don't want to wait for a thing that doesn't have a line for it. And so there's definitely something there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can think of a couple local places in town here too, where every time I go there, whether it's for lunch or breakfast, whatever, there's a wait. But why do I go back? Well, one, I go back because it's good, right? So let's not overlook that. Again, you got to have the level of competence. But when you can show other people, and so how do we put this into what we do? How do we create that kind of influence in what we do? And so one way to do that is to use what I call third party stories, right? So one of the things that I do when I'm sitting down across from a prospect is to talk about, when I've worked with businesses similar to yours in the past, here's some of the things that I've found, right? Or here's what business owners like you, or here's what people like you have experienced as they've gone through. And we'll talk about a third party story that they can relate to. But it also at the same time builds this idea that, hey, other people are apparently finding success through this and using this. And so that kind of goes back to that whole idea of using your clients, use your network to help build your business. So those third party stories, I think, are critical when it comes to influence.
When I was writing Anomaly, I'd written. It took me about 2 weeks to write the first part, and then 2 weeks to do the second part, which I'll get to. And basically, as I was rereading, I was like, and it was probably 35,000 words at that point. And I was like, there's something missing. And the third party stories, case studies, people are basically giving examples of what you're talking about is what was missing. And so I think it totally gives it more substance. It makes that story seem more real, even though it already is real. And it's super, super important. Well, you seem to consume a lot of content. What type of content are you consuming? And maybe give some shout outs to the people that you haven't already mentioned.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly online and reading a lot online and LinkedIn, and I'll give some specifics. But I read books. I'm still one of those dinosaurs. I like to actually hold. I've done a little bit of the digital stuff, the Kindle, but honestly, I like a book in hand because I can turn back to things. I can highlight it. I can reference it more easily, in my opinion. And I listen to a lot of Audible. I probably, I don't know. And so what kinds of books? Most of, probably 90+% of what I listen to is either personal development or sales or entrepreneurship and business in some way. Um, and so those that's the stuff that I'm most interested in. So some of the influencers and things that I read, we mentioned Bob Berg and Jim Rohn. um, Seth Godin, I think, is fantastic. I like what he does. I love, and these are maybe on the periphery of business, but Malcolm Gladwell, I think, is fantastic. Man, I just devour his books, love reading his stuff. I'm sure I'll forget some. Certainly, uh, 1004 through Hatch is a compendium of good knowledge and not only uh, resources but interviews and training and things. A lot of good stuff there. And then Sandler produces probably on the average of 5 or 6 books a year now, and so certainly get a lot out of those as they've started to develop sales books into various verticals. One of the things is that we learn in sales very early on is, and certainly in sales training, everybody thinks their problems are unique, right? So even though we find that many of them are across the board, if I can tweak language and speak a little bit differently to bankers than I do to, for instance, people in healthcare, right, that makes a difference. And so Sandler's created books that sort of apply the Sandler philosophies to a number of verticals. So I enjoy reading those as well.
So speaking in your target's language, I think that's so important. There's a part in my book, Anomaly, how to finally stand out from the crowd.
Can you pre-order that anywhere, Zach?
You can.
Just out of curiosity.
You can. Go to my website, startwithhatch.com/anomaly. But there's a part there that I use I like to say it in this language because I think it's so extreme. Like, you're very polite when you talk to your grandma, and your homeboys, you probably talk in extreme slang. You cannot talk to them both the same way. And so when you try to do that, guess what happens? You lose, you fail. The result that you want doesn't happen. A book that I'm listening to right now is called North by Scott Jurek. It's a story about how he speed ran the Appalachian Trail. I don't know if you've read it. I think it's fairly new. It's really good. I'll probably finish it tomorrow. You should check that out too.
I will.
I got it on Audible. What's something we haven't talked about that really excites you, or something that you want to talk about?
Well, so we've focused a lot on sales, and that's a big part of what I do. But probably more than a third of my business is focused on management and leadership, and not necessarily in sales. And so here's the thing, and to keep going back to this but in leadership and management, and we're talking about some people who run organizations, and people who run HR departments, and people who run accounting departments, right? But they all are looking for these skills, and what they're really looking for is a couple things. I think number one is, how do I increase my influence? And so we go back to that word, and we talk about how you increase your influence with your people. And then the other thing is, what systems can I put in place? And just like I'm a believer that in sales we need to have some sort of system, we need to know what the play is, right? What the series of plays are. What do we do? When the prospect does this, we should have that in mind. Same thing in leadership and management, right? So that's another piece that I'm a big believer in. I think there is such a thirst for good leaders out there, right? And you could, across any spectrum. I think, unfortunately, and this would be another podcast, but I think unfortunately we've lost some of, and some statistics and some models that I follow bear this out, that we are developing fewer quote unquote leaders, or people who would typically be thought of as leaders. And maybe that's part of because leadership looks a little differently now, and that's okay. But we do need to we need to reinforce our management and leadership teams. We want them to be effective. And so that's where I spend a lot of time. And then the third piece that I spend time on is just internal communication. And to me, that's such a big one. Once your organization, even once it grows from 1 to 2, you're going to find opportunities for communication, right? And communication improvement. And so those are a couple of things that I spend a lot of my time on.
I think when people really deep dive into the questions that they're hearing, or that people are asking them over and over again, it's almost always like one or two of the same thing. And so the reason I started writing my book was because I basically was hearing the same question over and over again in just a slightly different way. And I think you literally just said that. Like, when I deep dive into it, people want to know how to get influence and how to provide systems over and over again. I believe I just asked you this question, but I actually learned this question from you, and it's kind of an extension of what I learned in journalism. Something along the lines of, like, is there anything else? And I think I was at one of your training sessions once, and it's something along the lines of, you'll know it when you hear it. Like, what did you expect today, and did you get it? Something like that. What's that question that you say at the end to leave it? What is it?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple that come to mind,
Okay.
and I think the one you're looking for though is my last question. I told you I'm just such a big believer that questions are the key to all of this. And the last question I always, before I leave is there anything I should have asked that I haven't? Right? And that's it. And it's amazing sometimes the vein that you'll open up when you ask that question, right? Something that I wasn't either clever enough to uncover, or maybe they weren't comfortable sharing, being forthright and sharing that information with you. But that's always sort of the question that I end with is there anything else that I should have asked that I haven't? And I've gotten so much valuable information out of that question. And it does a couple things. One, I'm glad I asked the question, but two, teaches me that I need to up my game, because I probably should have figured that out, or gotten that information out 30, 45 minutes ago, or whatever it was. But that's the question I end with. The other thing that, another question that you brought to mind that I always ask at the beginning of a meeting is, what needs to happen in this meeting for you to consider it to be a success? Right? I like to start with that, because that gives me their perspective. What are they looking for out of the meeting? What are they hoping to get? And that's going to help, as you said, talking to the grandmother differently than we do to our friends. That's going to sort of help me shape how that meeting goes and the questions I ask, because I know, okay, this is what they want, so I need to find out this information to be able to give them that. So those I think are two important questions. Um, the other the other question I ask for anybody that deals with what I'd call a multiple yeah, a multiple visit sales cycle. So in other words, hey, I might have to talk to this person 2, 3 times. Sometimes it goes on for months. I have clients that you deal in 1.5 and 2 year selling cycles that are dealing with government entities and things like that. And one of the things that I always love to ask on any subsequent meeting is, one of my very first questions: has anything changed since we last spoke? And I think if you get that on the table early on, I think that's another question that will help save you a lot of headaches.
Got it. So what should I have asked that I haven't?
Uh, you should have asked if somebody was interested in checking out Sandler training in Hampton Roads. How would they look you up or find you? Is it okay for you to ask that question?
So if anyone was interested in your services in where you live, should they do? Yeah, where do they find out? Where do they find out about Chad?
Well, the website is ftt.sandler.com. That's franktomtom.sandler.com. But what I would invite anybody locally to do is you can give me a call. I'll give you my cell phone, 757-525-3672. I'm sure we can flash that up in post-production, 757-525-3672. And what I would invite you to do is just what we call crash a class, right? Come check out what I do. I'm hosting sales mastery courses every single week and leadership courses every month in my office. And so reach out and let me know if you'd ever like to just crash a class. And after you do that, then we can decide if it makes sense for us to talk further.
What if someone doesn't live locally to you and they're still interested in what you're doing? Can they still work with you?
Absolutely. They can still reach out via the web. One of the things Sandler's done is really invested a lot in our virtual training and our online training. And so we have virtual training courses that run every month. We have a huge online learn.com center type thing, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for people. And the other thing is, I may be able to point them, if they're looking for more of a live experience, I can certainly point them to a local Sandler trainer in their area and help them work with that person.